everybody. Reporting to you again from the Glamour City, Hollywood.
The overconsumption or thoughtless consumption around food has a devastating effect. People are talking about rising sea levels, as a huge climate change issue. We have to shift societally on a global scale how we consume.
If you love listening to this show, please consider giving a rating and a review on Amazon Alexa or wherever you listen. We want to continue bringing you this amazing content, and part of our ability to do that means that we need a big audience. Now, it may not seem like much, but rating and reviewing the show will help more people find us, just like how you found this show. Simply on any podcast platform, search for a show, scroll down to the bottom, and push 5 stars. It's that easy. Thanks for supporting the show. Today, I'm joined by David Moscow, creator, executive producer, and the host of From Scratch. Welcome to the show today.
Great to be here, Scott. Thanks for having me.
Wow. Some of your notable acting role was in the 1988 film Big as the young Josh Baskin, and also as David in the 1992 musical film Newsies. And you've also co-developed and co-produced Lin-Manuel Miranda's first production of In the Heights, which I absolutely loved. You've also produced Hellbender. That's also a favorite of mine. That was acquired by Lionsgate for North America and foreign distribution, as well as directing the psychological thriller Desolation. Amazing. Can you tell us a little bit about your background?
Wow, well, you hit all the big ones there. I started acting when I was 12. My second audition that I ever had was for Penny Marshall's Big. At the time, it was Robert De Niro, not Tom Hanks. So I was auditioning for a different part. But when Hanks came on, I got young Josh because I looked like him at the time. And then once you sort of, that was such a success with the Academy Award nominations and the box office that once you get something like that, you can work for as long as you want in front of the camera. And so that I did that for about 25 years, made 40 films, 5 television shows, ran a theater company in New York, which is where the Lin-Manuel, my dad called me up one day and said that his friend Luis's son had written about 20 pages of music. And would I listen to it? And I was like, oh no, this is a bad idea. There's nothing worse than sitting through bad theater, especially if it's a family friend. But against my better judgment, I said yes. And he came down with his college friends and I was like, lock the doors, this is amazing. So we developed that for about 9 months. And I went and found the first financier and brought in the casting director of Rent, and there it went. And then that sort of moved me into the other side, financing, sort of helping creatives, being of service and making their films. And I've produced about 25 movies. We've won Tribeca, been in competition at Cannes, been Sundance and South by, and it's been a really neat experience. And then from that came the show, the television show, which was initially a documentary about, I was just going to make a doc about how tacos are made and margaritas are made. At the time, Mexican Americans were really under attack by Donald Trump. And I thought that was ridiculous, especially living in California, where it's basically Mexico. And we all, the backbone of American food are Mexicans and Central American workers. And I just thought, a way to unify people was to see the hard work and the expertise that goes into bringing food to our table. So the idea behind the documentary was I would go to Oaxaca and harvest, work with subsistence farmers to harvest corn, make masa, go to Jalisco, harvest agave, make tequila, and show, everybody, where our sustenance comes from. And then my agent at the time said, you could do this with food cultures every week. This could be a television show. And one of the few times an agent has a great idea. Sorry, agents. I love agents. But anyway, so it was a great idea. And then we started developing okay, well, we'll go here next and here. And it's pretty incredible when you start diving into the food you love and where it comes from, and sort of like, oh, I want to do sushi. I want to go to Japan and do sushi and sake. I want to go to India, and you can make, India has so many different food cultures. You can make all different types of meals there. And then so we did that, and the show ran on A&E networks for 2 years, and now we're moving. Just signed a partnership with Tastemade, which is a big lifestyle brand, and we're now moving. Tastemade has channels on Amazon and Apple TV and Roku and Peacock, all over the OTT platforms, and we're in 17 countries now. So I'm about to head out for season 3, and one of the things when we were doing the show on basic cable, you don't really get to dive. You have 42 to 45 minutes to dive into something, right? And you come upon things, particularly, when we started to realize that food producers are on the front lines of climate change. You come upon stories that deserve their own episode, right? You could spend, the Maltese water crisis could be its own 45 minutes instead of the 5-minute section. So my father my father is a writer on the show as well, and so I got an offer to do a book, and initially they said, we'll hire a ghostwriter for you. It'll be it would be more of a fluffy type of book, but my dad and I kind of saw it as a chance to really tell in-depth stories around food production and on a fragile planet. So that's what the book is. It's from scratch, harvesting, hunting, fishing, and foraging on a fragile planet. So there is a lot of adventure, but then also some deep dives into science and economy and that kind of stuff.
Well, first of all, congratulations on your really a lifetime spanning, full of challenges and incredible accomplishments. And one thing I wanted to note, because you mentioned agents, is that many times agents, especially for celebrities, it's very common to associate with a charity. So the agent or PR would say, hey, attach yourself to a charity or some sort of brand. But you're different. And I, because I look for authenticity. And I think as early as college, you had temporarily, I don't know if you completely dropped out or temporarily dropped out to track wolves for a conservation study. So your activism isn't superficial because it's what's the hit of the day, but it's core to who you are. And I think the book From Scratch is an important story that tells the journey. Because I remember years ago, early in my career, when I was working at PwC, I met a colleague and she said, I don't eat chicken that have bones in it. And it didn't make sense to me. And it's because I didn't quite understand it back then, but I realized that it's because she was so far removed from the food cycle. She doesn't understand where food comes from and the sacrifice and the externalities that's caused. So the fact that you're talking about being able to go to the source, understanding the journey of the farming, the people at the front line, and how that actually goes to different wholesales distribution to retail, and we consume it, and the impact to climate change, that full cycle. And I wonder, why is that so important? And why do you feel like some of us are so disconnected?
Wow. That's at the core of, you really hit the core of the book. I mean, I started, one of the reasons I wanted to do the show, aside from showing sort of how unifying food production is, I had drifted in my consumption. I was, I live in LA, I go back and forth to New York, was living this sort of film producer lifestyle, and really was not paying much attention to what I was eating, what I was consuming, what I was buying in general, this thoughtless consumption, which I think is actually facilitated by the economy, right? They really want you to just consume as much as you can without a second thought. And what's interesting about food consumption is that it's if you overconsume, it's harmful, and that's why we see such huge obesity rates in the United States. But it also is harmful for the workers. Sort of this fast food mentality. I can get anything I want at any time. We saw it during COVID when we were forcing people to work in factory farms or in the meat packing world, and they were getting sick and dying, but we needed our food all the time, so that the economy wouldn't come to a halt. And then you go beyond that and you look at the effects on other animals, or the animals that you're eating, and then the environment as a whole. And so starting to, I'm not going to say, one of the things about the show and the book is that I'm not an expert. I didn't go to school. I don't have a PhD. When I dropped out to go track the wolves, I dropped out. So I tracked the wolves, then got a Broadway show. But I sort of have seen the show, the 5 years that I've been working on it, as field research in a way with experts. And so I ask the sorghum farmer in South Africa who had 7 years of drought followed by 7 years of floods, you tell me what's going on. And there's an interesting, the food production is like an onion. And once you start unpeeling it, at the core of this onion is the question, will humanity survive? And every single time we meet with somebody, when you get below the surface, the questions are huge. We were in the Philippines, and I was fishing for patis, which is a traditional Filipino fish sauce. It's like a fundamental ingredient in Philippine food and culture. And we went out to get fish, and we couldn't get any. And I asked the fisherman, "Hey, is this rare?" And he's like, "Nope. We go out further and further and stay out longer and longer." And my father got 10 times the fish, and his father got 10 times the fish than him. And when we did a deeper dive, we started to realize something was wrong when we were shooting the show. And then with the book, we realized that the South China Sea, where 1/3 of the fishing boats in the world are, has basically decimated the fish stocks. And it's lost 70% of its fish in the last 20 years, 90% of its fish in the last 50 years. And there are all these territorial disputes going on, around this sea. And yet nobody has been able to reach across the territorial dispute and say, "Hey, I know you think that this is your fish and ocean, shipping lanes, and I think it's mine. But if we don't do something, there's going to be nothing there." So the overconsumption or thoughtless consumption around food has a devastating effect. People are talking about rising sea levels, as a huge climate change issue. But food, us being able to feed ourselves, is also one of the reasons is not only because of the overfishing in the South China Sea or in the Mediterranean, but because of the warmer waters. That's wiping out a lot of our food. And so we have to shift societally on a global scale how we consume. Another interesting story is we were in the Mediterranean, which has similar issues to the South China Sea, except that the Mediterranean was never really a fertile body of water to begin with. There's no major river that runs into it. And it's been actually hammered by 28 countries for over 10,000 years. And so it's pretty close to being dead. Now, the Italian government, while we were there, realized this. And so they started putting rules around, fishing, which is incredible. But Croatia saw that and said, "Oh, they're pulling back. We can dive in." And so Croatia then filled the gap. So it's the tragedy of the commons in that way. It really is going to be our societies are going to have to change. The way we look at international relations is going to have to change. We are going to have to get together and figure out holistic solutions, or we're in deep trouble.
Yeah, you cover a lot of different ground, but let me just kind of back up a little bit, just kind of personal anecdotal, is that one of the best things that I've done recently is to have my own garden. So it's about six, raised areas. And I grow everything from leafy greens to herbs and whatnot. And the reason it's been a great experience is it allows for me to have ownership. And I think that's very important in a society where private property framework is important. When we understand, when we invest into that and put the effort into it, and when we reap the benefits, when I make a salad out of that, it's just so rewarding. Not to mention, it just tastes better as well. And there's a greater appreciation. And I think in your book, Chef Gunnar Carl Gislason, Michelin star dill in Iceland, he said, if you pick the food yourself, you tend to prepare it with more care and have a better story to tell. And I think that's really powerful. And this notion of distance, and I think the fact that because your work has forced you to have to travel to these localized regions and see the impact yourself. Now, the thing with food is you gave a few case studies, but it's so broad, right? There's monocultures to things where we're wiping down forests so that we can start to have agriculture.
Yep.
To fishery, like you talked about. And then, of course, the pesticide. I mean, part of the reason I don't consume certain, things, like I'm Korean and I like firm bracken, but, most of it's made in China. I refuse to eat it because I know it's just covered with pesticides, for instance. Right. So there's a lot of concerns. And at the end of the day, it's a huge issue. But the general things that we hear, and again, I'm mostly raw vegetarian, but for the most people, whether you're talking about South Americans, Australia, North America, or even Europe, meat, protein is a big part of their diet. And it's so integrated into their culture. I mean, you talked about Mexican culture early on, pork, lamb, beef. It's just so ingrained. How do you separate that? How do we become more focused on plant-based and start to take away from what we're doing through these livestocks and heavy cattle farming?
Well, I think in the larger way, you push your governments, your local governments, to finance subsidizing produce. Right now, there are huge subsidy. The beef industry, the cattle industry gets an enormous amount of money. Whereas if that were going to leafy greens or even organic products, organic vegetables, that changes things. So on a sort of get out, use your voice, demonstrate. On a personal level, I and my family have made a decision that we are going to, if we're going to eat meat, which we're trying to move the meat from the center of the plate and a daily event to a rare occasional event, a special occasion or appetizers. And there's lots of other people before me. I think Mark Bittman from the Times, this was one of the things he was trying to do. And Michael Pollan talks about this as well. But, we also have decided that if we're going to buy meat, it should be from a farm where we know that the workers are treated humanely, that the animals are treated humanely. And that usually has a tendency to be more expensive, which means we buy less meat. And so it's this kind of cyclical, if it hits your wallet, you're like, okay, well, then we're not going to do that. Or we're going to save it for something special. In the book, we did this thumbnail sketch of, how many animals I've eaten in my lifetime. And it was about, I think, 37,000 animals, which is pretty mind-blowing. And I'm not anything special in that area. I'm just an American of this time. I eat probably a couple, protein dishes a day since I was a little kid. And that's what and I had never participated in the death of them. So I didn't know the damage. I don't understand the damage that I'm actually doing. And so, like you're growing your own vegetables, which we do as well. I actually got my mom some bees for for her birthday a few years back. So we do honey, and my in-laws have a big chunk of land where we can actually grow a bunch of stuff. But even here in my backyard, we've got tomatoes and blackberries and stuff like that. But I also thought that it was important to see, if I was going to eat meat, to see what that really meant. And so on the show and in the book, I talk about slaughtering a pig, and I went on a deer hunt, but I also made a barbecue around Texas. And those emotional experiences were what caused me to reduce the amount of meat consumption. I think being closer to the food, whether it is in a garden or whether you have to slaughter your own animal, it's transformational. It goes from thoughtless consumption to thoughtful consumption. You realize, I mean, you pull up to a farm and you know you're going to have to slaughter a pig, and you're just like, I really don't want to do this, or in the midst of it, you're like, get me out of this. This is a terrible thing that I've just done. And, I had to stay in it because I made this decision to eat other animals. And I think, in the conversation, I have 2 kids, and my son has traveled with me for the show, and he's been there for some of this, and he decided he was vegetarian. I mean, for a period of time, he was vegan, but he decided he was vegetarian, and that's changed our table. He didn't want to eat, piglet or Wilbur, and so we, as a family, started eating dramatically less animal products. So definitely, I think you hit the nail on the head. If you start to have your own ownership of things, you're raising the vegetables, you're raising the animal. It changes how you interact with it.
There was a point in my life when I was a little child. I actually lived on a farm. I guess it was kind of a livestock farm, and there was this one baby sheep that for some reason was orphaned, and we called it Pee-wee, and kind of became our pet. Anyways, we tried to reassimilate it back with the other sheeps, but the older ones ended up crushing her to death. And to this day, I have a hard time eating lamb. But that's an example of that kind of first-hand experience. Yeah. But one of the things I want to point out is, for most of our listeners, a lot of this message they get already. They're already doing it. That's not the target audience. And I feel like the bi-coastals, sometimes we're referred to as the educated, the affluent, the liberal, although I'm not sure if I'm liberal. But really the message needs to go towards kind of the middle of America, right? Yeah. And for them, like I said, it's so ingrained in who they are, the culture. It maybe even speaks to the machismo aspects of eating meat. I remember going to a grocery store, buying lots of vegetables, and the guy behind me said, "What's wrong with you? Are you a sissy? How come you're not eating meat?" So how do we get the message to the people that really need to listen, and what's the best way to convey that message to them? Because they don't want to hear about taxing beef, taxing the things that they eat.
Well, it wouldn't be taxing. Right now, we subsidize beef. The government gives the beef industry money for there to be cheap meat. And that is very harmful. Just, in the free economy, let beef stand on its own and see if people, are going to consume as much of it rather than propping it up. It's very funny that you said that. I was are you a sissy? Because I was in Wyoming going there to do a deer hunt, and I was with my crew at the local Walmart, and we were picking up some food because we all had an Airbnb that we were living at while we were doing the show. And the cashier was there, and she picked up the asparagus that I had, and she goes, "You're not from around here. What are you doing here?" And I was like, "Oh, we're here to hunt." And she was like, "Oh," but it was a very funny moment that just reminded me of what you just said. I think, Well, number one, our show was on the A&E channels, which really targets the middle of America. So that we were speaking to the people who don't necessarily get talked to a lot. And it was very successful. We grew, 420% from episode 1 to episode 20. So we really found an audience that was interested in what we had to say. And I think part of the reason is because sometimes the coastals will talk down to the people in the middle of the country, and or at least they don't mean to be talking down, but the way that the conversation is going, it feels like they're butting heads as opposed to all living on the same planet. And I have a lot of family in Utah and Montana, and I always look to them. One of the reasons I did the show is because I feel like, the people who actually do the work sometimes are disrespected. And I really wanted to show what hard work and expertise looks like. And my cousins love it because they see me, a coastal guy, trying to do this stuff, and I have no knowledge, and I'm idiotic on some of the episodes, like I'm failing left and right. So they get to watch me fail. And at the same time, I'm showing, the work that they do in a really, really important light. And I think that if you create a show that really celebrates the cultures and the work ethic, then you can have these conversations. Because again, I'm not the one having the conversation, or I'm not the expert. So literally, people get to hear from the farmers, from the hunters, from the fishermen themselves. This is what's going on. And I think my cousins respect those people. And so we do have a mix. We talk to professors and scientists and activists as well. But I think it really is important to hear the on-the-ground stories from the people who, are struggling to maintain our food supply. So I think trying to figure out a way to have a conversation is the most important part. And how do you talk to people in a way that you're hearing them and they're hearing you? And I feel like that's one of the fun things about the show and fun thing about the book.
So I want to say thank you, because I think ultimately at the quintessential aspect of it, it's about respecting what they do, respecting their culture, and respecting their hard work in this food supply ecosystem that we're talking about. So with that, I have been joined by David Moscow, creator, executive producer, and host of From Scratch.
Thank you.
If you've enjoyed this episode, take a moment to rate our show on any podcast platform that you listen to. Scroll down to the bottom and push 5 stars. It's that easy. And as always, thanks for listening.